In a quiet suburban town, a devoted father faces the unimaginable, a mysterious tragedy that claims the life of his 10-year-old daughter. But when unsettling details surface at her funeral, James Bennett refuses to accept the official story. Armed with a hidden camera and an unrelenting drive for justice, he uncovers a chilling conspiracy that shakes the very foundation of his community. Whispers in the shadows, a trail of deceit, and a fight against all odds. This is a story of love, loss, and the unstoppable quest for truth. What James discovers will change everything. But before we begin, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. We also wish you and your loved ones a warm, joyful, and happy New Year. And if this story touches your heart, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. We'll be bringing you more amazing stories tomorrow. Now, let's embark on this journey together. James Bennett was the kind of father every child deserved, a man devoted entirely to his 9-year-old daughter, Mia. His life revolved around her, and she was the light that kept him going after his wife, Elena, had walked out on them 5 years ago. Their modest home in the quiet suburbs of Pinecrest was their little sanctuary, filled with laughter, love, and the occasional chaos of art supplies strewn across the living room. Mia, a bright and imaginative child, loved to draw. Her world was a colorful canvas of trees, stars, and smiling faces. That morning, the Bennett's kitchen smelled of sizzling bacon and warm toast. James stood by the stove, flipping pancakes, while Mia sat at the table with her sketch pad, drawing what she called, in quote, "the greatest picture ever," end quote. "Make sure you give me muscles," James joked, flexing his arm as he set a plate in front of her. Mia giggled, holding up her sketch of a stick-figure version of them, both under a big tree. "You already look strong, Dad," she said, her grin infectious. It was a simple moment, one of many that James cherished. But he didn't know it would be their last. The day had started like any other, but it took a turn James could never have anticipated. By afternoon, Mia had begged to go to the local park, where the playground was always bustling with children. James, torn between work and spending time with her, reluctantly agreed. He had deadlines for the auto repair shop he managed, but decided he could spare an hour. He dropped her off, promising to pick her up soon. As the hours ticked by, James found himself distracted, glancing at the clock every few minutes. Something about letting her go to the park alone gnawed at him, but he pushed the thought aside. It wasn't uncommon for her to play with friends while he finished work. When the phone rang, just as he was about to leave the shop, his heart sank. Somehow, before he even answered, he knew. The voice on the other end was calm, almost mechanical. End quote. "Mr. Bennett, this is Officer Harding from Peaceful Pines General Hospital. I'm afraid there's been an incident involving your daughter. We need you to come immediately." End quote. James didn't remember much of the drive to the hospital. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The streets blurred as he sped through town, replaying 100 scenarios in his head, each worse than the last. The waiting room was cold and sterile, a stark contrast to the chaos consuming James's mind. The antiseptic smell seemed to cling to his skin as he sat on the stiff plastic chair, waiting for answers. When a doctor finally emerged, her face carried the weight of unbearable news. "We did everything we could," she said softly, her words striking like a thunderclap. "Mia suffered a fatal head injury. We're so sorry for your loss." James's world crumbled in an instant. The details of the accident barely registered. Something about her falling from the jungle gym. The words washed over him, meaningless and hollow. He couldn't believe it. His Mia, his vibrant, laughing, full-of-life Mia, was gone. He stumbled through the next few days in a haze. Arrangements were made for the funeral, though James couldn't recall how or by whom. Friends and neighbors offered condolences, their words bouncing off the wall of his grief. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw Mia's smile, heard her laughter, and felt the unbearable weight of her absence. On the day of the funeral, the sun shone brightly, as if mocking the darkness that had settled over James's heart. The white coffin, trimmed with silver, looked out of place among the rows of somber gray headstones. As James stood by her grave, his sister Sophia placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. but no words could reach him. Mia's drawings were scattered around the house, unfinished masterpieces that would never be completed. One sat on the dining table, the last picture she'd worked on, depicting a father and daughter under a giant tree. It was unfinished, much like the life she had been robbed of. As James looked at the small casket lowered into the earth, he made a silent promise. He wouldn't let Mia's memory fade. Whatever had happened that day at the playground, he would find out. The world could label it an accident, but deep inside, James felt a nagging doubt that refused to let him rest. The cracks in the official story began to surface as the days went on. But for now, all James could do was grieve. And even in his grief, a flicker of resolve began to grow. Mia had been his world, and though she was gone, James couldn't let her go without answers. The journey for truth was just beginning. The day of Mia and Appo's funeral felt surreal to James Bennett. The bright sunlight seemed indifferent, casting harsh rays over the rows of mourners gathered at Evergreen Peaceful Pines Cemetery. James stood silently, clutching a program with Mia's photo on the cover, a snapshot of her wide smile and sparkling eyes, frozen forever. His sister Sophia stood beside him, offering quiet support, but James was barely aware of her presence. The world around him was muted, every sound muffled beneath the heavy weight of his grief. As James approached the open casket for one last goodbye, something stirred in him, a mix of dread and unease. He leaned over to kiss Mia's forehead, his heart breaking at how unnaturally pale she looked. Her tiny hands were folded across her chest, and the pink dress she wore was one she had picked out for a school recital that never happened. At first glance, she appeared peaceful, as though merely asleep, but James couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It was then that he noticed the bruises. Dark, irregular marks were faintly visible on Mia's forearms, peeking out from beneath the long lace sleeves of her dress. James's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't been told about bruises. The hospital report had mentioned a head injury caused by a fall, but there had been no explanation for this. His mind raced as he traced the pattern of the marks, trying to make sense of them. Were they from the accident? Or had something else happened? Then his eyes caught another detail, a faint layer of dirt beneath her fingernails. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but once James saw it, he couldn't unsee it. His heart sank as a chill ran through him. Why would there be dirt under her nails if she had fallen on the rubber padding of the playground? He tried to push the thought aside, blaming his grief-stricken mind for playing tricks on him. But the questions lingered, clawing at the edges of his consciousness. The atmosphere at the funeral home did little to ease his unease. The staff, a group of 3 individuals led by a man named Roger Tillman, appeared indifferent at best. James overheard them whispering in hushed tones as they adjusted the casket. He couldn't make out every word, but one comment stood out sharply. And quote, "Let's get this over with. Families like this never ask too many questions anyway," end quote. One of them muttered, followed by a dismissive chuckle. James froze. He knew exactly what end quote, families like this end quote, meant, and the blatant discrimination sent a surge of anger through him. He turned to confront them, but they dispersed quickly, leaving James seething in silence. Sophia noticed his clenched fists and tried to calm him, but he couldn't let it go. "This isn't right," he whispered to her, his voice low, but trembling with emotion. "They're treating us, like we don't matter." "James," Sophia replied gently, "you're grieving. Don't let them ruin this moment for you. Mia deserves your focus, not them." But it wasn't just their comments. It was everything. The bruises, the dirt, the rushed tone of the entire service. James couldn't shake the feeling that something had been overlooked, or worse, deliberately ignored. That night, as the family gathered at Sophia's house for a somber dinner, James barely touched his plate. The questions in his mind refused to quiet down. Each detail replayed itself with increasing intensity. The marks on Mia's arms, the dirt under her nails, the funeral home staff's dismissive attitudes. The more he thought about it, the more convinced he became that something was wrong. "Do you remember if the hospital mentioned bruises?" James suddenly asked Sophia, breaking the silence. Sophia looked at him, startled by his intensity. Bruises? No. They said it was a head injury from the fall. Why? James hesitated before answering. There were bruises on her arms today, and dirt under her nails. Sophia frowned, her fork hovering over her plate. James, you've been through so much. Maybe it's not just grief, Sophia, he interrupted, his voice rising. This doesn't add up. How does a child who supposedly fell on a padded playground end up with bruises and dirt like that? Sophia's eyes softened with concern, but she could see the determination in her brother's expression. What are you going to do? She asked cautiously. James didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared at the glass of water in front of him, his mind already racing ahead. I don't know yet, he admitted, but I can't let this go. The idea came to him in the middle of the night, long after the house had fallen silent. James lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts a tangled web of suspicion and sorrow. If no one else was going to take a closer look, he would have to do it himself. By dawn, James had made up his mind. He drove to an electronics store on the outskirts of town, where he purchased a small, discreet camera. The cashier gave him a puzzled glance, but didn't ask questions. Back home, James carefully examined Mia's casket. The thought of tampering with her final resting place made him sick to his stomach, but the nagging doubts were stronger than his discomfort. He carefully disassembled part of the casket's lining, his hands trembling as he positioned the camera. It was angled to capture the interior and activated by motion. Once satisfied, he replaced the lining and stepped back, his heart pounding. It felt wrong, unnatural, even, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Mia's death was more than the simple accident everyone claimed it to be. He needed answers, and if this was the only way to get them, so be it. Later that day, Sophia stopped by and noticed the tension in James's demeanor. When he reluctantly told her about the camera, her reaction was immediate. You did what? She exclaimed, her voice rising. James, this is madness. Installing a camera. In her casket? What are you even hoping to find? I don't know, he admitted, his voice cracking. But if something happened to her, if someone's hiding something, I need to know. I can't live with myself otherwise. Sophia sighed deeply, torn between her concern for her brother and her own reservations. And what if you're wrong? She asked softly. What if there's nothing to find? Then at least I'll know I tried, James said, his jaw set with determination. I owe her that much. As Sophia left, James sat alone in his living room, staring at the screen where the live feed from the camera played. It showed only darkness, the still and silent interior of the casket. Hours passed with no movement, but James remained vigilant, his heart heavy with a mix of dread and hope. The night was heavy with silence as James Bennett sat in his dimly lit living room, staring at the small monitor in front of him. The live feed from the hidden camera he had painstakingly installed in Mia's casket showed only darkness, the cold, empty interior of the coffin. He told himself he was being paranoid, that his grief was twisting his perception. But the questions wouldn't let him go. Something about Mia's death didn't feel right, and he needed answers. James had spent the day wrestling with doubt. Installing the camera had felt intrusive, almost disrespectful, but the bruises on Mia's arms and the dirt under her nails haunted him. The funeral home staff's indifference, the veiled comments, and the rushed handling of her body had all pointed to a deeper, unsettling truth he couldn't yet grasp. As night fell, Sophia arrived at his house, her expression a mix of concern and exasperation. You're losing it, James, she said as she sat down across from him. You put a camera in her coffin? Do you hear yourself? James leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. I hear myself, Sophia, and I know how it sounds, but I can't shake the feeling that something's off. I have to know. Sophia sighed, her eyes softening. And what if you don't find anything? What if this just fuels your grief even more? Then I'll live with it, James replied firmly. But at least I'll know I didn't give up on her. Sophia was silent for a moment, then nodded reluctantly. Fine, but promise me you won't let this consume you. Mia wouldn't want that. As midnight approached, James sat alone, his eyes glued to the monitor. The feed remained still and silent, the faint hum of the camera the only sound in the room. He had replayed the events of the past week in his mind countless times, searching for any detail he might have missed. The hospital's explanation, the funeral home's dismissive behavior. None of it added up. Just as he began to think he might have been wrong, a flicker of movement caught his eye. He leaned closer to the screen, his breath hitching. At first, he thought it might be a glitch, a stray pixel or interference from the equipment. But then it happened again. A faint shadow moved across the frame, slow and deliberate, as if someone or something was inside the coffin. James's stomach twisted. His rational mind scrambled for explanations, a trick of the light, a malfunction in the camera. But the shadow moved again, this time accompanied by a faint scraping sound, like nails dragging against wood. His heart pounded as he turned up the volume, straining to hear more. The scraping grew louder, interspersed with muffled noises. Indistinct at first, but gradually forming into something chilling. Voices. They were faint, almost like whispers, but unmistakably human. James froze, his fingers gripping the edge of the desk. He leaned in closer, his ears straining to catch every word. "Just get it done," one voice murmured, calm and detached. "They'll never notice," another replied, followed by a low chuckle. James's chest tightened. His mind raced as he tried to process what he was hearing. The voices were distant, but their tone was chillingly casual, as if they were discussing something routine. He rewound the footage, playing it again and again, hoping to make sense of the cryptic exchange. As the minutes ticked by, the whispers faded, replaced by an eerie stillness. James sat back, his body trembling. The recording confirmed his worst fears. Someone had tampered with Mia's body. The implications were too horrifying to fully grasp, but one thing was clear. This was no accident. He spent the next few hours replaying the footage, his mind a storm of disbelief and fury. The shadows, the scraping, the whispers. They painted a picture of something sinister, something no grieving father should ever have to confront. But James knew he couldn't ignore it. Whatever had happened to Mia, he owed it to her to uncover the truth. By dawn, James's exhaustion was outweighed by determination. He copied the footage onto multiple devices, including a USB drive and his cloud storage, ensuring it wouldn't be lost. He couldn't afford to take any chances. The next step, however, was less clear. Who could he trust with this? The police had already dismissed his concerns, and the funeral home staff had proven they couldn't be relied upon. When Sophia returned that morning, she found James pacing the living room, the USB drive clutched in his hand. She looked at him with a mixture of worry and resignation. "What's wrong now?" she asked. James held up the drive. "I caught something on the camera," he said, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. Voices. Talking. About getting it done, and no one noticing. Sophia, they did something to her. Sophia's face paled. She sat down slowly, her eyes wide. "James, are you sure? See for yourself," he said, plugging the drive into his laptop and playing the footage. As the recording played, Sophia's hands flew to her mouth. By the time the whispers ended, tears were streaming down her face. This is insane," she whispered. "What are you going to do?" James's jaw tightened. "I don't know yet, but I'm not letting this go." As the sun rose higher in the sky, James felt the weight of the truth settling on his shoulders. He had no idea where this path would lead, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't turn back now. The shadows inside Mia's coffin had revealed more than just a mystery. They had awakened a fire in James, one fueled by love, grief, and an unyielding need for justice. James Bennett couldn't shake the echoes of the voices he'd heard on the footage. "Just get it done." The words churned in his mind like a storm, relentless and infuriating. By morning, his determination solidified into action. Someone had tampered with Mia's body, and James was going to find out who and why. The first place he went was Carter and Amp, son's funeral home, the small, unassuming building where Mia had been prepared for burial. It looked harmless enough, with its neatly trimmed hedges and pale blue shutters, but to James, it now seemed like the facade of something much darker. He pushed open the heavy oak door, the chime above ringing faintly. Inside, the air smelled of lilacs and disinfectant, a cloying combination that turned James's stomach. The receptionist, a young woman with a practiced smile, looked up from her desk. "Mr. Bennett," she greeted, her tone overly cheerful. "How can we assist you today?" James didn't bother with pleasantries. "I need to speak with Roger Tillman," he said firmly. "Now!" The receptionist hesitated, her smile faltering. "I believe Mr. Tillman is busy. I'm not leaving until I talk to him," James interrupted, his voice low but steady. The steel in his tone left no room for argument. A few minutes later, Roger Tillman, the funeral director, appeared. He was a stout man in his late 50s, his face lined with years of dealing with grief-stricken families. But there was a coldness in his eyes that James couldn't ignore. "Mr. Bennett," Tillman said, extending a hand James didn't take. "I'm very sorry for your loss. How can I help you today?" James didn't waste time. "I have questions about my daughter's body," he began, his voice trembling with restrained anger. "She had bruises on her arms and dirt under her fingernails. Neither of those things were explained to me." Tillman's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something, discomfort, in his eyes. "Bruising can occur naturally during post-mortem processes," he said smoothly. "As for the dirt, it's not uncommon for small amounts of residue to remain, even after thorough cleaning." "That's not good enough," James snapped, his fists clenching. "I want a real explanation, not excuses." Tillman's demeanor shifted slightly, his voice taking on a defensive edge. "Mr. Bennett, I understand your grief, but I assure you, there was nothing unusual about your daughter's preparation. These things happen. Things like voices whispering about getting it done and nobody noticing." James shot back, his voice rising. "I have footage. Do you want to explain that?" For the first time, Tillman looked genuinely unsettled. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said stiffly. "If you have concerns, I suggest you file a formal complaint with the proper authorities." James glared at him, his chest heaving with anger. "Oh, I will," he said, his voice cold. "Believe me, I will." Leaving the funeral home did little to ease James's fury. He drove home in silence, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. When he arrived, Sophia was waiting for him, her worry evident. "How did it go?" she asked as he stepped inside. James threw his keys onto the table, pacing the room like a caged animal. "He brushed me off, tried to explain everything away with natural processes. I called him out on the voices, and he looked like he wanted to crawl out of his skin. He knows something, Sophia. I'm sure of it." Sophia hesitated, then said softly, "Do you have proof? Something concrete you can take to someone who'll listen?" James stopped pacing and looked at her, his jaw tightening. "I have the footage," he said, "and I'm taking it to the police." Later that evening, James and Sophia walked into the Pinecrest Police Department, the USB drive containing the damning footage tucked safely in James's pocket. The front desk officer, a young man with tired eyes and a name badge that read Officer Gaines, looked up as they approached. "I need to speak with a detective," James said, his tone firm. "About what?" Gaines asked, clearly unimpressed. James leaned forward. "About my daughter, and what I found." After a long pause, Gaines sighed and picked up the phone. "Take a seat. Someone will be with you shortly." Detective Sarah Holloway met with them in a small, sparsely decorated office. She was a no-nonsense woman in her early 40s, her sharp gaze giving the impression that she missed nothing. James explained his suspicions, handing over the USB drive as he spoke. Holloway inserted the drive into her computer and began to watch the footage. James and Sophia sat in tense silence, waiting for her reaction. As the muffled voices played, Holloway leaned forward, her brow furrowing. When the recording ended, she sat back, her expression unreadable. "This is unusual," she admitted. "But the audio is unclear, and the shadows could be a glitch. It's not enough to open a criminal investigation." James stared at her, disbelief and anger flaring in his chest. "You're kidding me," he said. "You heard them. You saw the footage. How is this not enough?" Holloway sighed. "I understand your frustration, Mr. Bennett, but without more substantial evidence, there's not much we can do. The voices could be anything, and the video doesn't conclusively prove wrongdoing." "Not much you can do?" James repeated, his voice rising. "My daughter's body was tampered with. And you're telling me you can't do anything? I'm sorry, Holloway said, her tone firm but not unkind. I truly am. But my hands are tied. As they left the station, James felt a heavy weight settle over him. The police, like the funeral home, had dismissed his concerns. Sophia tried to comfort him, but he barely heard her. His anger simmered just beneath the surface, fueling his resolve. That night, as James sat alone in his living room, the shadows from the monitor flickering on the walls, he made a silent promise. If no one else would fight for me, I would. No matter how long it took, no matter what it cost, he would uncover the truth. After the dead ends with both the funeral home and the police, James Bennett found himself in a suffocating haze of frustration and anger. Each unanswered question about Mia's death weighed heavily on him, and he realized he needed another approach. If the authorities wouldn't listen, perhaps the public would. That evening, while scrolling through local news sites, James stumbled upon an article exposing corruption in a nearby housing development project. The story had been written by Lauren Reyes, a young journalist known for her fearless reporting and knack for uncovering the truth. Something about her writing struck a chord with James. Her work wasn't just thorough, it was relentless. Without hesitation, he drafted an email. Subject: I need your help, dear Ms. Reyes. My name is James Bennett. My 10-year-old daughter, Mia, recently passed away under suspicious circumstances. I've been dismissed by both the funeral home responsible for her preparation and the police. I have evidence that something is being covered up. Attached is a file that I believe you need to see. Please, I'm begging you, help me uncover the truth. Sincerely, James Bennett. After pressing send, James stared at the screen, half expecting an immediate reply. Hours passed, with no response. By the next morning, doubt began to creep in. Maybe Lauren wouldn't take the story. Maybe she thought he was just another grieving parent grasping at straws. But just as James was about to lose hope, his phone buzzed. Mr. Bennett, this is Lauren Reyes, a confident voice said when he picked up. I got your email. We need to talk. They agreed to meet at a small coffee shop on the outskirts of town. When Lauren arrived, James was surprised by her youthful appearance. In her late 20s, with sharp features and piercing green eyes, she carried herself with a quiet determination that immediately put him at ease. Thank you for meeting me, James said as she slid into the seat across from him. Your email intrigued me, Lauren replied, pulling out a notepad. And your footage, it's disturbing, to say the least. But I need more. If I'm going to publish anything, I need a complete story. Tell me everything. James recounted the events leading up to Mia's funeral, the strange behavior of the funeral home staff, the bruises, the dirt, and the voices on the recording. Lauren listened intently, jotting down notes and occasionally asking pointed questions. By the time James finished, her expression was grim. This funeral home, she said, tapping her pen against the notepad. Carter and Amp. Sons, right? I've heard whispers about them before. Complaints that never went anywhere. It's time we change that. Over the next few days, Lauren threw herself into the investigation. Her first step was to comb through public records and online reviews for any sign of misconduct. What she found was both alarming and infuriating. Carter and Amp. Sons had faced multiple complaints over the years, ranging from mishandled bodies to overcharging grieving families. Most of these cases had been quietly settled out of court, leaving little public trace. But Lauren wasn't satisfied with surface-level details. She began contacting families who had previously used the funeral home services. Many were reluctant to speak, but one elderly woman, Mrs. Harper, finally agreed. Her story was chilling. Her husband's body had been left unrefrigerated for days, leading to advanced decomposition. When she confronted the staff, they dismissed her concerns and threatened legal action if she pursued the matter further. Lauren shared this information with James during one of their late-night meetings at her office. This isn't just about you, James, she said. This is a pattern. They've been getting away with this for years. The breakthrough came when Lauren tracked down Adam Turner, a former embalmer at Carter and Amp Sons. It wasn't easy. Adam had moved to a nearby town and was living a quiet, almost reclusive life. Lauren and James met him at a diner late one evening. the neon lights casting a harsh glow over their table. Adam was a man in his 40s, with tired eyes and a nervous demeanor. He fidgeted with his coffee cup as he spoke, his voice low and cautious. "I shouldn't even be talking to you," he began. "If they find out, they won't," Lauren assured him. "This stays between us. We just want the truth." Adam hesitated, glancing around the diner as if expecting someone to burst in. Finally, he sighed. "They cut corners," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "All the time. Bodies not properly embalmed. Coffins reused to save costs. I left because I couldn't stomach it anymore." James leaned forward, his fists clenched. "Did they do anything to my daughter?" he demanded. Adam's eyes flicked to James, guilt written all over his face. "I don't know for sure," he admitted, "but I've seen them tamper with bodies before. Bruises can come from rushed handling. And the dirt," he trailed off, shaking his head. "It could mean they moved her after the initial preparation. It's not supposed to happen, but they do it." James's stomach churned as Adam's words sank in. The bruises, the dirt, the voices, they all pointed to negligence, maybe even something worse. He felt a surge of anger and determination. Whoever was responsible for what happened to Mia was going to pay. Lauren, sensing his resolve, placed a hand on his arm. "This is just the beginning," she said. "We'll keep digging, and when we have enough, we'll make sure the world knows." For the first time in weeks, James felt a glimmer of hope. He didn't know what lay ahead, but with Lauren's help, he was ready to fight for Mia and for the truth. The morning Lauren Reyes's article went live, the town of Pinecrest woke up to headlines that sent shockwaves through the community. And quote, "Funeral home scandal. Family alleges negligence in child's death." End quote. James Bennett sat at his kitchen table, his hands trembling as he scrolled through the article. Lauren had woven the story masterfully, combining the facts of Mia's death, the unexplained bruises, the dirt under her nails, and the damning accounts from Adam Turner and other families. It was both heartbreaking and enraging, and James couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. Finally, people would see what he'd been fighting for. The reaction was immediate. Comments flooded the article's page, and social media buzzed with outrage. Locals shared their own harrowing experiences with Carter and Amp, son's funeral home, revealing a pattern of negligence and greed. Within hours, James's phone was ringing nonstop. Friends, distant relatives, and even strangers reached out, offering condolences and support. But not all the attention was welcome. By midday, James began receiving anonymous calls, some filled with veiled threats, others outright hostile. "You're making a big mistake," one voice snarled before hanging up. Another warned, "Drop this, or you'll regret it." Sophia, ever the voice of reason, urged him to step back. "James, these people clearly have something to hide, and they're desperate. Maybe you should let the police handle it now." James shook his head, his jaw set. The police didn't care before. Why would they care now? "I'm not stopping, Sophia. Not until I know the truth." Lauren's article caught the attention of Pinecrest City Council and local advocacy groups. A town hall meeting was hastily organized, with residents demanding answers. Under mounting pressure, the police department reluctantly reopened the investigation into Mia's death. Detective Sarah Holloway, who had dismissed James's claims earlier, was now tasked with leading the case. Holloway visited James at his home to apologize. "I underestimated you, Mr. Bennett," she admitted. "We're taking this seriously now, but we'll need your cooperation moving forward." James wasn't interested in apologies. "What changed your mind?" he asked sharply. "Lauren Reyes has a way of bringing the spotlight where it's needed," Holloway replied. "And public outrage can't be ignored." Though skeptical, James handed over the footage again, along with new testimonies Lauren had gathered. He could only hope that this time, Holloway would follow through. Meanwhile, Adam Turner was grappling with his own fears. Lauren had reached out to him with a request that was both terrifying and empowering: to testify publicly. Adam had spent years trying to bury the memories of his time at Carter and Amp, sons, but the thought of Mia, a child, being treated so callously gnawed at his conscience. One evening, Lauren and James met Adam at a quiet park to discuss the next steps. Adam looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes, his hands fidgeting with a coffee cup. I don't know if I can do this, Adam admitted. They're powerful. They've gotten away with this for years. What's to stop them from coming after me? They're already scared, Lauren said, her voice calm but firm. The article hit them hard. If you speak out, it'll be the nail in their coffin. They can't silence everyone. Adam glanced at James. You really believe this will make a difference? James nodded, his voice steady. Mia deserves justice. And if we don't stand up to them, they'll keep doing this to other families. Adam took a deep breath, then exhaled slowly. I'll do it, he said, but I'll need protection. In the days that followed, the tension in Pinecrest reached a boiling point. Protesters gathered outside Carter and Amp, son's funeral home, holding signs that read, "Justice for Mia and no more neglect." News crews swarmed the area, their cameras capturing every angle of the growing scandal. James watched from a distance, overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the movement his fight had sparked. But the threats against him escalated. One night, James discovered the words "Stop Digging" spray-painted across his garage door. Another time, a brick shattered his living room window, narrowly missing Sophia, who had been sitting nearby. We need to go to the police, Sophia urged, her voice shaking. They're already involved, James replied, his anger boiling just beneath the surface. This just proves we're getting close. Lauren, ever the strategist, used the growing attention to push for deeper investigations. She uncovered financial records showing that Carter and Amp, sons had ties to questionable suppliers and a history of falsifying documents to cut costs. She also found evidence suggesting the funeral home's director, Roger Tillman, had used political connections to bury past complaints. The revelations painted a damning picture, and with Adam's agreement to testify, Lauren knew they had a strong case. She organized a press conference where James, Adam, and a handful of other families shared their stories. I didn't want to speak out, Adam said, his voice trembling as he stood at the podium. But seeing what happened to Mia, I couldn't stay silent anymore. Families deserve to know the truth. His testimony sent shockwaves through the community. News outlets picked up the story nationally, and the once untouchable Carter and Amp, sons, was now the center of a firestorm. The pressure on the funeral home was immense. Roger Tillman released a public statement, calling the allegations baseless and accusing James and Lauren of exploiting Mia's death for attention. But the statement only fueled the fire, as more families came forward with similar allegations of misconduct. Through it all, James remained resolute. The threats, the vandalism, the backlash, it only strengthened his resolve. He spent hours reviewing evidence with Lauren, meeting with lawyers, and supporting other grieving families who had suffered similar injustices. One evening, as James sat with Sophia, going over the latest updates, she placed a hand on his arm. You're doing something incredible, she said. Mia would be proud. James looked at her, his eyes filled with determination. It's not over yet, he said, but I won't stop until it is. The day of the trial arrived with the weight of months of preparation, fear, and determination. James Bennett stood outside the courthouse, staring up at the imposing stone facade. The early morning sun glinted off the steps where protesters had gathered, their signs bearing slogans like "Justice for Mia" and "No more neglect." Beside him, Sophia placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. You ready for this? She asked softly. James took a deep breath. I have to be, he replied. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with tension. On one side sat James and his attorney, Madeline Pratt, a sharp-witted lawyer Lauren Reyes had recommended. Madeline exuded confidence, her reputation for taking on high-profile cases preceding her. Next to James was Adam Turner, visibly nervous but resolute in his decision to testify. Lauren sat a few rows behind them, offering silent support. On the opposing side were the funeral home's legal representatives, a team of high-powered attorneys led by Robert Chase, a man known for his aggressive tactics and ability to sway juries. Roger Tillman, the director of Carter and Amp, Sons, sat stiffly at their table, his face a mask of indifference. The opening statements set the tone for the trial. Madeline's voice rang clear and firm as she outlined the evidence. The hidden camera footage, Adam Turner's testimony, and the pattern of negligence uncovered by Lauren's investigation. This case isn't just about one family's tragedy, Madeline declared. It's about a business that has operated without accountability for years, preying on the grief of vulnerable families. Today, we will prove that Carter and Amp, Son's funeral home, not only failed in their duties, but actively covered up their misconduct. When Robert Chase stood to deliver his statement, his tone was calculated and dismissive. He painted James as a grieving father blinded by his emotions, suggesting that his suspicions were baseless and his evidence circumstantial. "Mr. Bennett has suffered an unimaginable loss," Chase said, his voice oozing with feigned sympathy. "But grief can cloud judgment. The claims against my client are speculative at best, driven by paranoia and fueled by a sensationalist media narrative." The prosecution's case began with James taking the stand. Dressed in a simple black suit, he sat upright, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. Madeline guided him through his testimony, allowing him to recount the events leading up to the funeral, the bruises and dirt he had noticed, and his suspicions about the funeral home's conduct. When Madeline played the hidden camera footage for the courtroom, a hush fell over the room. The grainy video showed the interior of Mia's coffin, and though the visuals were limited, the audio was damning. The muffled voices, their casual indifference, and the chilling phrases, "just get it done and they'll never notice," hung heavy in the air. James watched the jurors' faces as they listened. Some flinched, others exchanged uneasy glances, but none looked indifferent. When Robert Chase began his cross-examination, his tone turned sharp. He questioned James's decision to install the camera, suggesting it was an invasion of privacy and a sign of his paranoia. "Mr. Bennett," Chase said, pacing the courtroom, "you were grieving the loss of your daughter. Isn't it possible that your emotions led you to misinterpret what you heard?" James's jaw tightened. "What I heard was real," he said firmly. "And it wasn't grief, it was instinct. Something wasn't right, and I couldn't ignore it." Chase pressed further, attempting to sow doubt, but James held his ground. By the time his testimony ended, his determination was evident, and the cracks in Chase's argument had begun to show. "Next, Adam." Turner took the stand. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the microphone, but his voice grew steadier with each word. He recounted his time working at Carter and Amp, Sons, detailing the shortcuts taken to save money, reused coffins, improperly handled bodies, and falsified records. "They told us no one would notice," Adam said, his voice tinged with bitterness. "Especially not families like the Bennetts. They thought grieving people wouldn't ask questions." The defense tried to discredit Adam, pointing to his departure from the funeral home and suggesting he held a grudge. But Madeline countered with a powerful rebuttal, highlighting the consistency of his testimony and the corroborating evidence Lauren had uncovered. The turning point came when Madeline introduced a series of records Lauren had obtained through relentless digging. These documents revealed a pattern of negligence stretching back over a decade. Complaints had been filed, but most were quietly settled or dismissed. One particularly damning piece of evidence was a memo from Tillman himself, instructing staff to prioritize efficiency over protocol. Chase's confidence visibly faltered as the prosecution's case grew stronger. The weight of the evidence, combined with James's and Adam's compelling testimonies, began to shift the tide. During closing arguments, Madeline addressed the jury with a heartfelt plea. "This isn't just about James Bennett or Adam Turner. It's about accountability. It's about ensuring that no family has to endure the pain of being treated as if their loved one doesn't matter. Today, you have the power to deliver justice, not just for Mia, but for every family that has been wronged." Chase's closing argument, though impassioned, lacked the same impact. He reiterated claims of speculation and paranoia, but struggled to counter the overwhelming evidence presented by the prosecution. The jury deliberated for 3 tense days. James barely slept, the waiting stretching his nerves to their breaking point. When the verdict was finally announced, the courtroom was packed with reporters, supporters, and onlookers. As the jury foreperson stood, James held his breath. "On the charge of gross negligence, we find the defendant, Carter and Amp, Son's funeral home, guilty." The words hit James like a wave of relief. Sophia squeezed his hand tightly, tears streaming down her face. Adam let out a shaky breath, his shoulders slumping in quiet triumph. Lauren sat silently, a small, satisfied smile on her face. The verdict was a victory, but it was bittersweet. The funeral home was ordered to pay damages, and several employees, including Tillman, faced criminal charges. Yet, as James left the courthouse that day, he knew the battle hadn't been just about winning. It had been about Mia, about making sure her story mattered. Outside, the protesters cheered as James stepped into the sunlight. He raised his hand in gratitude, his voice steady as he addressed the crowd. "This isn't just a win for me or my family," he said. "It's a step toward justice. For Mia. For all of us." The courtroom victory marked the end of one battle, but James Bennett knew the fight for justice was far from over. As he stood outside the courthouse that day, the cheers of supporters ringing in his ears, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The verdict had held Carter and Amp, sons accountable, but James wanted more than retribution. He wanted change. In the weeks following the trial, James found himself reflecting on everything that had led him to this point. He thought about Mia, her laughter, her vibrant personality, and her endless curiosity about the world. She had dreamed of becoming an artist, her drawings often scattered across the house, unfinished masterpieces waiting for her to return to them. Her life had been stolen, but James realized her legacy didn't have to be. One afternoon, as he sorted through a box of Mia's belongings, James came across her last drawing. It depicted the two of them standing under a massive tree, hand in hand, surrounded by a swirl of bright colors. Beneath it, she had scrawled the words, "Always together, Dad." Tears welled in James's eyes as he held the drawing. It was a reminder of their bond, unbroken even by her passing. In that moment, an idea began to take shape, a way to honor Mia's memory and ensure that no other family would endure what they had. Within months, James had founded the Mia Bennett Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to combating discrimination and improving post-mortem care standards. The foundation's mission was twofold: to advocate for systemic reforms in the funeral industry and to provide resources and support for grieving families. James poured his energy into the foundation, using the compensation from the lawsuit to kickstart its initiatives. The foundation partnered with local advocacy groups and began hosting workshops, educating families about their rights when dealing with funeral services. They also launched a scholarship program in Mia's name, supporting students pursuing careers in forensic pathology and mortuary science, fields where ethical practices were sorely needed. The foundation quickly gained traction, drawing attention from national media. James became a prominent voice for reform, speaking at conferences and community events. His story resonated deeply, not just because of its tragedy, but because of the hope and determination that followed. Lauren Reyes, who had been instrumental in exposing the truth, continued to report on the broader implications of the case. Her investigative series on systemic negligence within the funeral industry gained widespread acclaim, prompting calls for legislative reform. In one of her articles, Lauren highlighted the lack of oversight in funeral services, pointing to the ease with which businesses like Carter and Amp, Sons had operated for years without accountability. She advocated for stricter regulations, including mandatory audits, standardized training for funeral home staff, and harsher penalties for violations. Her work didn't go unnoticed. State lawmakers began drafting bills aimed at addressing these issues, many of them citing James's case as a catalyst for change. Lauren's tireless reporting ensured that the momentum didn't wane, keeping the story in the public eye and pressuring officials to act. The journey had changed James in profound ways. He had entered the fight consumed by grief and anger. But through his work with the foundation, he discovered a sense of purpose that transcended his personal loss. He saw how systemic issues, discrimination, negligence, and lack of accountability affected countless families, particularly those from marginalized communities. James began to speak openly about these broader issues, using his platform to shed light on the intersections of race and socioeconomic status in the funeral industry. He shared stories from families who had reached out to him, their experiences mirroring his own. Each story reinforced his belief that change was not just necessary, but urgent. Grief is universal, James said during a keynote speech at a national conference. But how we're treated in our most vulnerable moments shouldn't depend on the color of our skin or the size of our bank account. We have to do better for everyone. The impact of James's work rippled far beyond Pinecrest. Funeral homes across the state began implementing new policies, spurred by the increased scrutiny and public demand for reform. Some facilities voluntarily sought accreditation from independent oversight bodies, while others faced pressure from newly enacted legislation. Families who had once felt powerless began to find their voices, empowered by the resources and support provided by the Mia Bennett Foundation. James often received letters from people thanking him for his advocacy, their words a testament to the far-reaching effects of his efforts. Back home, James found solace in small moments. He framed Mia's unfinished drawing and hung it in the living room, a constant reminder of her light and the mission she had inspired. Beneath the frame, he placed a plaque that read, "In loving memory of Mia Bennett, always together." Sophia visited often, her presence a steady source of comfort. They would sit together beneath the framed drawing, reminiscing about Mia's boundless energy and creativity. For James, those moments were bittersweet, a reminder of what he had lost, but also of what he had gained through her memory. The story of James Bennett was not just about one man's fight for justice. It was about the resilience of the human spirit. It was a testament to the power of grief channeled into purpose, of tragedy transformed into hope. James's journey also illuminated the importance of systemic accountability. His case was a stark reminder that negligence and discrimination often thrive in the shadows, unnoticed and unchecked until someone dares to shine a light on them. It underscored the need for vigilance, for voices willing to speak out even when it's uncomfortable or dangerous. On the first anniversary of the trial's verdict, James visited Mia's grave. The cemetery felt different now, less oppressive, more peaceful. He knelt beside her headstone, tracing the letters of her name with his fingertips. "I did it, baby," he whispered. "I made them see you, and I won't stop. Not ever." As he stood, a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the nearby trees, carrying with it a sense of calm. For the first time in a long while, James felt a semblance of closure. Mia's memory lived on, not just in his heart, but in the foundation that bore her name, in the lives it touched, and in the changes it inspired. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this heartfelt journey. Your time and attention mean the world to us. If this story moved you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you won't miss more inspiring tales like this one. Together, let's continue sharing stories that touch hearts and bring hope. See you in the next chapter.